Hello everyone, welcome back to AS Biology with Dr. Demi. I am Dr. Demi, and in today's video I will be starting chapter 7 of the AS Biology syllabus, which is transport in plants. Now I know that for many students this chapter is just hellish. Many students say they feel haunted by it, but I want you to know that it is a very easy chapter, and as much as possible I will be very clear in my explanations. If you have any questions you would like to ask me, please post them in the comment section and I promise to get back to you as soon as possible. If you haven't watched other videos and you'd like to revise for other topics, please just check my video list and you will see that I am posting in chronological order the AS Biology syllabus, so you will find whatever it is that you are looking for. So let's get into it. Transport in plants. So the first question I usually ask students in the classroom is, how do plants grow? And students say, well, the plants use sunlight, they use water, they use all of these nutrients that are in the soil, and the combination of that helps them to grow. That is absolutely correct. Plants use sunlight for photosynthesis, which is the process through which they make food. Now, when you get into your A-level section, you will see that photosynthesis is a more detailed process whereby the plants are able to capture light and use that light to split water and then use that in the formation of sugars. Plants also take up mineral ions and water from the soil, so they are able to grow by using a combination of photosynthesis and the uptake of mineral ions and water. Now, when we speak of plants, or we say transport in plants, the big question then is, what do plants need to transport? Just like I have said, plants need to transport water. They also need to transport the products of photosynthesis. So it's just like you when you eat food and that food goes into your stomach. It doesn't sit in your stomach for the rest of the day. It is digested, broken down, and the nutrients within the food are absorbed, and then they are distributed through your blood to other parts of your body where they are needed. In the same way, when plants make their food, they also need to distribute this food, which we call them nutrients, or you can just say sugars. They need to distribute the sugars to other parts of the plant. And so what plants need to transport are water, organic and inorganic nutrients, as well as their hormones. Yes, that's true. Plants have hormones. And here's a fun fact for you. Some plants have hormones called phytoestrogens, and these estrogens are estrogen mimickers in people. So some people say that when they eat a lot of plant hormones, they find that they have the same response as they would have if they were secreting normal human hormones. So I just thought to share that with you. When we speak about the transport system in plants, there are two transport systems, or should I say two transport vessels that you must know. You have the xylem, which is responsible for transporting water and inorganic ions, and you have the phloem, which is responsible for transporting the products of photosynthesis all across the plant. Xylems take water from the roots and they move in only one direction, which means they move from the roots upwards. And so they take water from the roots and distribute it to the leaves, to the stems, and to other parts of the plant. The phloem, on the other hand, will take the products of photosynthesis from the leaves, because the photosynthesis occurs in the leaves. They take the products of photosynthesis from the leaves and they distribute it to other parts of the plant. So when we speak about the transport of water in the plant, remember we said that it is simply movement through the xylem and it goes from the root upwards to other parts of the plant. Something I want you to bear in mind is to remember, or something I would rather prefer you to recall, is the definition that has transport of water in it from cell membranes and transport in chapter 4. If you can recall, we said osmosis is the movement of water from a region of higher water potential to a region of lower water potential. In the same way, the movement of water through a plant is actually osmosis. So what happens is that water will move here from the soil into the root hairs. From the root hairs, it goes to the root cortex and then goes into the xylem and then goes through the other parts of the plant. What this simply means is that the water in the soil is the highest water potential at that point in time, and the root hair will always have the higher water potential. And because of that, water moves in this direction from the soil to the root hair into the xylem and to other parts of the plant. And the question obviously is that if plants are able to absorb water from the soil, certainly there has to be a point where the plants have enough water, where they say, okay, well, we don't need more water, so we need to stop absorbing. Well, that time hardly ever comes because plants are constantly absorbing water from the soil. And why is that? The reason that occurs is that when water is moving in through the soil, it goes into the root hair, as you can see here, goes into the root cortex, goes to the xylem, and then it goes through the xylem to the shoots, and it goes to the leaves. Now, when you get to the leaves, you have these interesting structures called the stomata. The stomata usually open to absorb CO2 from the environment and to release oxygen. And that is why we say we live in a state of balance with plants. We as humans, we take in oxygen and we breathe out CO2, while plants take up CO2 and they release oxygen. Now, when the stomata open, inevitably, some of the water that has been absorbed will leave the stomata as water vapor. We call that process transpiration. Transpiration causes the water potential in the leaves to reduce, which then means that more water has to move up from the xylem into the leaves, from the root cortex to the xylem, from the root hair to the root cortex, and from the water in the soil into the root hair. So what is basically being created here is what we call a water potential gradient, which means that as water continues to evaporate through the stomata on the surface of the leaves, then we start to have movement from the soil into the root hair, into the xylem, and again it leaves through the leaves as long as the stomata are open. So transpiration is a very, very important term to learn. And also when we speak about this, we call it the transpiration pull, which simply means that by the effect of water escaping as water vapor through the leaves, we have a pulling effect that causes the root hairs to absorb more water so that more water can move up to the xylem, into the leaves, and keep everything in a state of balance as much as possible. So, what are the factors that affect transpiration? Well, the very first one you need to know is humidity. Whenever humidity is low, you will have a faster rate of transpiration. The big question, of course, is what is humidity? Humidity is the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So if you have a situation or a region whereby the humidity is very, very low, what that means is that the water vapor in the atmosphere is at a low concentration. And obviously, that then means water will move from a region of higher water potential in the leaves to a region of lower potential in the atmosphere, and that causes the rate of transpiration to be faster. So we say that the lower the humidity, the faster the rate of transpiration. Wind speed is another factor that would affect transpiration. Obviously, the higher the wind speed, it means that the water vapor is blown off very quickly by the wind, and that then will cause more transpiration to occur because the water is constantly moving from a region of higher potential to a region of lower potential. When we have very dry conditions, a plant may close its stomata to avoid losing water, and when it does that, that affects the rate of transpiration because the rate of transpiration will reduce when the stomata are closed. When temperature is high, then obviously transpiration rate will also be higher, and this can be explained by the fact that when temperature is high, water molecules will move faster, which means that the water within the xylem would move faster upwards to the leaves, and then obviously it would be dried up very quickly by the high temperature, or it would be transformed quickly to a gas, and then it would be blown off, or it would simply just evaporate. So temperature also affects transpiration in that way. Light intensity is another factor. We know that stomata would open during the day because remember, stomata are opening to take up CO2, which is a very important factor in photosynthesis. So during the day is when the stomata are likely to open because that's when the sun is out, and as a result photosynthesis can happen. However, at night the stomata tend to be closed. So when the stomata are closed at night, just like when it's in very dry conditions, the rate of transpiration is very low. And when the stomata open during the day for the entry of CO2, then the rate of transpiration is a lot higher. This is a special group of plants called the xerophytes. So what I have just described in terms of transpiration is speaking about plants in general, how they operate. But there are some plants which we call xerophytes that tend not to follow the same rules. Xerophytes are plants that have been adapted to survive in regions that have very little water, and so they have various adaptations that enable them to not lose water, and so it means that their rate of transpiration is a lot less, or in some cases it is non-existent. So some xerophytes have things like thick cuticles that prevent water loss. Some of them have very few stomata. Some of them have very small leaves, and if the leaves are small, it means the surface area for photosynthesis is small, which means that even if the stomata were to open, there would be very little loss of water because of how small the surface area is. And some of them have waxy coating in their stems that help to prevent water loss. These are plants that you would typically find in a desert where there is very little water, yet they are able to survive. Now let us go into xylem in detail. Now xylems are simply tubes, right? If you look at this image over here, you can see that the xylem, it's like a long tube, and they are made from cells that are basically joined from one end to the other. So think of it as you trying to make a long pipe. If you're trying to make a long pipe and you only have small bits, then you would have to either weld them together or glue them together in order to make a long pipe. So in the same way, xylem vessels are made from cells that are joined end to end. The cells in a xylem tube or in a xylem vessel are all dead, which means they are not metabolically active. They don't carry out any functions. All they simply do is to transport water. Xylems also have a material we call lignin. Lignin is a very tough material, and it helps to strengthen and thicken the xylem vessels so that they don't collapse when they are transporting water. Now, when we speak of flowering plants, we say here that the xylem vessels contain vessel elements, and they also have tracheids. The tracheids are simply involved in water transport. Something I have noticed is that it is just important for you to learn the different aspects or the different parts of a xylem vessel. For example, you need to know that the sclerenchyma fibers are elongated cells that help to support the plant, while the parenchyma cells are used to support food storage, such as starch. But these are not necessarily things that you might be asked in the exam, but I often advise my students to please learn them because you never know when a question will creep up on you. So, big question is, how does water travel from the soil into the root hair? When you look at a root hair, I don't know if you've ever uprooted a plant, but when I was in high school, that was some of the things that we had to do as punishment, to like clear the gardens or things like that of weeds. And you notice that when you uproot a weed and you look at the roots, you will see tiny extensions, tiny hair-like extensions. These extensions are called root hairs. And what the root hairs do is that they can grow and elongate and reach into spaces between the soil particles to absorb water. Now, many plants would have millions, thousands of root hairs, and what this allows is a faster absorption of water into the root so that the water is able to then move into the xylem. Root hairs also enable plants to absorb mineral ions like nitrate and magnesium because they are so tiny. So if you look at this image here, this is an image that was uploaded by a researcher on researchgate.net. So you can see her name there, Lisa Amiot. And this image here just shows you how microscopic root hairs can look. So plants are able to get their water by extending this thin extensions into the soil and absorbing water in between spaces, from spaces that are in between the soil particles. Now, there are two pathways through which water can move. You have the apoplastic pathway and you have the symplastic pathway. And you can see here, I have put this image here just to show you how the different pathways differ, how the pathways differ from each other rather. So the apoplast pathway, as you can see there, is the one in purple. And you can see there it is a pathway through the cell. So it never goes through the cytoplasm of the cell. It simply goes between the cell wall and the cell membrane. Remember from chapter 1 that we said that plants are double membraned structures, which means means, or plant cells rather, are double membrane structures. So that means that you have a cell wall and you have a cell membrane. And so the water in the apoplast pathway will move between that. It doesn't go through the cytoplasm. The symplastic pathway is when water is moving by osmosis through the cytoplasm from one cell to the other, and it also moves through what we call the plasmodesmata. So I hope you remember the plasmodesmata from chapter 1. It is simply the organelle that connects two different cells, two different plant cells together, and you don't have it in an animal cell. So now that we know that water travels through the symplastic pathway, which is basically across the cytoplasm, or the apoplastic pathway, which is over here, let me use a pen to indicate this to you. As you can see there, it is traveling between the cells without going through the cytoplasm. What we then need to remember is how water goes from the root hair into the xylem. So water will move into the root hair from the soil, again due to a difference in water potential, and it moves through the root hair until it gets to a section called the endodermis. Once it gets to the endodermis has a strip called the Casparian strip. That's that strip over there. The Casparian strip, let me just circle that again so that you can see it clearly. It has the strip over here called the Casparian strip. The Casparian strip is a thick strip that simply forces the water to start to move through the cytoplasm. So you can see here, if you're following this direction of water with the black line, or the one I've drawn red on, that the water was moving in between the cells using the apoplastic pathway. However, once it came across the Casparian strip, it started to go through the cytoplasm, and it travels from there until it reaches the xylem. The reason why this happens is that plants need to be able to regulate the amount of mineral ions that are coming into the cytoplasm, and the Casparian strip enables them to do that. And as a result, the water is then able to move into the xylem, and it is pulled through the xylem up to the leaves and distributed to other parts of the plant. So we've already discussed how water moves from the soil into the root hair, and from the root hair into the xylem. And from the xylem, we know that the water is then moved upwards to the leaves, and it is lost through the leaves by transpiration. Now, when water is lost through the leaves, it means that the water potential in the leaves will always be low, and that then causes the xylem to continue to transport water to the leaves. Simply what this means is that transpiration creates a water potential gradient, whereby water continuously moves in the same direction from the root upwards to the leaves. Something else you have to know is that water will move through the xylem through what we call mass flow. Mass flow means that water molecules and the solutes that are absorbed from the soil will move as one body of liquid. And what helps this to happen is simply that water molecules have what we call the forces of addition, and they also have the forces of cohesion. Addition simply means that the water molecules are able to bind to the vessels, to the walls of the xylem, as you can see over here. And cohesion means that water molecules are able to bind to each other. And so by doing that, it helps the water to move by mass flow, because all the molecules are bound together, and the walls of the xylem support this upward movement by creating the right pressure. So I don't know if you've ever been in a situation whereby a pipe burst on your street and then it had to be fixed. Because of that, everybody turned off their taps. The waterworks guys came, they fixed the leak, and then you had to turn on your tap. And when you turn on your tap, there's no water coming through, just air, and you can hear it's really loud. This has happened because there's been an air bubble in your pipe flow, simply because of all the interruptions that have happened. In the same way, when you have an air bubble in a xylem, what will happen is that the column of water will break, and that means that water will not be able to move upwards through the plant. So the xylem is adapted to prevent this loss of water, or should we call it the loss of pressure that drives the transport of water. So how does the xylem prevent these airlocks? First of all, the xylem diameter is very small, and because it is small, it prevents the water molecules from being able to make room for an air bubble, because the molecules molecules, remember, are cohesive, so they continue to move together. The xylem vessels also have these things we call pits, and pits will allow water to move into neighboring vessels, so that even if there is an airlock in one xylem vessel, the other xylem vessels are still able to transport water. Pits will also allow water to move into neighboring living cells, those are the plant cells in the different parts of the plant, so it ensures overall an efficient transport of water. Now, when we speak about transport in plants, we have just spoken about how water is transported. Something else that you need to know is that plants also transport carbohydrates, they transport nitrates, phosphates, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And many of these will move through the symplastic and the apoplastic pathways. And they can move either through mass transport, which is also bulk transport. They can move through diffusion, facilitated diffusion, or active transport. This brings me to the end of the very first part of transport in plants. I hope that wasn't too difficult or too detailed or too content heavy for you. If you have any questions that you would like to ask me, please post them in the chat and I promise to answer them as soon as possible. That would be it for me from now, and then I will post the next video which will speak more about transport in the phloem. Until then, have a good time.